All right, good morning. Thank you all for coming. And today we'll be discussing about atavism and sexual behavior. And I know that you're probably thinking about what does the word atavism means. And I actually started giving lectures in Spiritism by usually getting always one word in my title that normally people don't see or use, just to captivate their curiosity. So we are going to see what atavism is, of course, so do not worry about it. Then, before we start, just a few ground rules, all right? So every now and again you're going to see a slide like this that is blank. Don't panic, it's not a problem with the display. It is basically that when you have a slide there, it means that I'm craving your attention. You have to be looking at me, okay? So I have to look at me, that nothing is going to be distracting you over there. That's all, right? So these are the ground rules. Number one, this lecture is not about sexual identity, sexual preferences, okay? It's not about that. It is about how we behave when we think about this small word, sex, which is in most languages one of the shortest words you can find in everyone's vocabulary, and yet it brings us the largest headaches possible. We are always in a sense of, we have this idea of taboo, and then we have all the most non-constructive ways of looking at it. We are afraid of discussing it, we are afraid of educating others or educating ourselves first and foremost. And with that we end up misbehaving and taking the consequence of this misbehavior to other reincarnations. So this is what we are going to be talking about today. How is it that our behavior today can affect that part, and how our past behaviors has been affecting our current one, okay? The other point that I want to make is that whenever we'll talk about male, female, I'll try to use the word gender and not sex, so that we don't get things confused. So every time I use the word sex here, I'll be referring to the sexual act. Instead of just saying sexual act is a little longer, okay, I will just say sex. So whenever I want to refer to male, female, if there is any need actually for that particular discrimination, then I'll refer to the word gender. I will try to use that word. And finally, just before we start, you have to get used to the way I present my talks. There is usually the first part or the first third of it that has some background information. Because I believe that every time, if you want to be serious about learning something, you cannot start at the top. And it's actually something that I notice we don't pay much attention to these things. It's like if you decide to learn a new language, you decide to learn Greek, that you would just take one of the Greek poets or writers and you would try to translate them, but you don't even know the Greek alphabet. Well, you might, by cranking it, eventually translate a line or two, but the amount of work that you invest is phenomenal for very little in return, and you are bound to make assumptions that are not correct. So bear with me for the first part, especially if you don't have more of a biology-oriented mind or scientific mind. It is important, and you're going to see that some of the background that I'm going to present today can be used to explain any form of addiction as well. Like was said in the small synopsis about the lecture, about overeating, about, for instance, any drug use that we have, or drinking, anything that is binging behavior that we overdo, all right, can be explained with what I'm going to present to you, which is going to be presented in a simplified form, but still true. So, having said all this, let us start. The very first thing that we are going to do is the word atavism. Atavism comes from biology. It's a word that Spiritism borrowed, captured from the field of biology, and it means the following. Whenever there is a trait that skips a generation, we call that an atavic trait. So atavism has to do with genetic inheritance. Okay, let us put this into plain English. Basically, here's you, all right? So if you now, in red, you have some sort of genetic trait on your physiology or on your on the outside, hair, anything that has skipped one generation, the previous generation, of course. So that would be uncles, aunts, mothers, father, and so on. But was present here, okay, in the previous one, either your grandfather had, or your grandmother had, or one grand aunt or a grand uncle. As long as it skips an entire generation, this, whatever you have here, right, is an atavic inheritance. Well, that's the biology, right? So it's skipping a generation. So what does that have to do with Spiritism? Very simple. We believe that the moment of conception is when a spirit is attached to that first initial cell, correct? Well, if it's at the moment of conception, in normal cases, both father and mother have to be present, right? Have to be alive. But because we cannot be associated with two different bodies at the same time, it means that I cannot be my own father or mother, but I can be my own grandmother or grandfather. So it skips a generation. It is this idea. So for us in Spiritism, atavism basically means any inheritance we bring from a past reincarnation. And the closest thing that we can be is if we were our own grandfather, our own grandmother. In other words, I gave birth to a person, and then this person, man or woman, later on had a kid, which would be my grandkid. But if I have died in the meantime, I can, in principle, it's not usually that fast, but in principle, I could now be associated now with that new body, the body of my grandchild. So in other words, I am my own grandfather, spiritually speaking. Okay, please, spiritually speaking, because this sentence alone is a little disturbing when we think of it physically, but spiritually. So this is atavism for us. This is nothing more than spiritual inheritance. Everything we have done, suffered in the sense of experienced in a past life, that now comes to us in this life. And then everything that we are collecting now in terms of sensations, in terms of experiences, in every sector of our lives, that we are going to move forward to. What we are doing now is collecting what will become the atavism for the next. Okay? That's as simple as that. So we move away from the biology, and now we go into the Spiritism thing. So let us have a quick look at the model of the creation currently used. Remember, it's a model, which means it's a work in progress, but this is what we have at the moment. It's been very helpful to us. We have the creation, right? And we have a physical plane, the plane we are in right now, this one that is physical, that we have the physical body, right? Remember, the physical plane is also material. But the reason why we don't say it material, it will be clear to you in a moment, because we have to make a slight difference there. We have to make a distinction there. So anything that is not physical is the extra-physical. Notice that I did not call it spiritual plane, and there is a reason for it. Okay? Give me a minute. So right now, I am using our reincarnation as the dividing line. Anything that is physical, physical plane. Anything that is not physical, extra-physical, beyond the physical. Good? So then I can take the extra-physical plane and divide it again into two parts. This part is the non-material part of the extra-physical plane. The essential part, the essence. All right? And then there is a part that is material. Material, but not physical. This part here is material and physical. So I could actually, in principle, have divided the creation here, call this the spiritual plane, just this part here, the essential plane, and so on. And then these two together, I could have called it the universal fluid. the part that is material, which then can be subdivided into material, non-physical, and material and physical. So when we are talking, because we don't like to use too many words, we just say physical here and material over there. And this is how we now associate these parts. We, the essence, the soul, the spirit belongs to this side of the creation in our model. Then we have, pay attention to the verbs. We are the soul, the spirit, the essence. But we have a perispirit. And if we are reincarnated like that right now, as all of us here are, okay, we also have a physical body. The physical body belongs to the physical side, the perispirit to the material side, but not physical. And the soul is in the essential, ethereal, non-material part of the creation. This is our model. And why is it important for us to remember this every time we're studying Spiritism? Because there are lots of things that we are doing that requires us to keep this in mind. For instance, right now we have the physical body, right? I just said. But this physical body is actually under the control of my perispirit. You see this right under here as a column? And of course, the perispirit is in control of my soul, of my spirit, which I won't even bother to represent. Right now, we are going to be focusing all our attention in this dividing line here between the material or perispiritual side and the physical or the physical body side. As I am living my life here in the physical plane, my perispirit is taking like snapshots of everything that I do. Taking snapshots. When my physical body dies, which is the only thing that dies, and this is why I am focusing my attention on this dividing line, because death only applies to this side, never to that one. Okay? Whether we are talking about the perispirit or the soul or the spirit, we are never talking about death here. Death is only the extinction of the temporary physical body we have. So this line here is death. When we cross it this way, we call it reincarnation. When we cross it from right to left, discarnation, or the death of the physical body. So during our life here, our perispirit is taking snapshots. As this passes away, expires, as a perispirit now, we look at the snapshots, all right? And we use those snapshots to improve ourselves or not. So if we live our lives like that, guess what we are going to be seeing on those snapshots? Those tiny those pictures we say, oh, I'm too fat on this one, I'm too short on that one, I'm this and that. And we are trying to cut ourselves out of the pictures. It won't work. Okay? Because the pictures that we are taking, the snapshots, are here in our mind, which is actually, we say like this, but it's actually in the spirit. So it won't be able to erase those pictures. However, if we live our lives, okay, in a different way, all right, we live our lives like that, then when the moment of discarnation happens, guess what type of snapshots we are going to have? Good ones, positive ones, constructive ones. And these snapshots are going to be used for our future reincarnation when we have to build a new physical body, which is what we see in this case, all right? Before we saw discarnation, now it is reincarnation. It's still the same creation model, the same line. And remember, it is our perispirit that builds the physical body. There is no supermarket shelf in the spiritual plane where you go and say, I want the body of this Adonis, or I want the body of that top model, or I want the body of this or that can do this. There is no such a thing. We, as perispirit in this case, of course, we are the essence, we are here. But together with our perispirit, right, which is the material part, we sculpt the new physical body. I'll just stop this because this guy is really going at it. Okay, he's getting, so just freeze it for a moment, that you got the gist. We are sculpting our physical body. And once that physical body is ready, we take that physical body, we reincarnate. So I can only sculpt this according to my abilities. So for instance, if you give me a piece of clay and you ask me to build a vase, I have to put a little label at the bottom. This should look like a vase. Because I'm terrible at sculpting things. I have very little artistic abilities in that sense. But here, fortunately, it's not exactly like you have to be a Michelangelo or you know, some important painter, you know, to paint a beautiful physical. No, we are going to use those snapshots, and it's our moral and intellectual side that is going to actually assist us in building this physical body. The more we know, the more we have evolved morally, intellectually, the better our physical bodies will be, healthier physical bodies. The less we know, the more, the coarser this physical body would be, and the more unhealthy it will look or feel. So, as we can see, it is a cycle, all right? As we live, we collect snapshots. When we discarnate, we take the snapshots to build that new physical body upon the time of our reincarnation. So from this circle here, from this interaction between the two sides, just you know, around this dividing line, now you figure out how important it is for us to live a healthy life here. Because everything we are doing right now, if you think of this moment from here to the future, everything that we are doing is affecting what is to come. And if you now look backwards, if you look in the other direction, all that we are today is nothing more than the natural consequence of everything we did in the past. Nothing else. There isn't such a thing as, oh, okay, now I am expiating because I did this, this, and that, and I'm being punished. No. We can change that if we want to. If I did something in the past that was horrible or non-constructive, and I change myself from that moment until now, I will not be expiating anything. This is merely a consequence of what I am. Nothing more, nothing less. So we have control on these things. That is what is important. From this point on, you have absolutely signed your life on that piece of paper up front that you signed in the spiritual plane, mind you, okay? You have signed with your own spiritual blood that you have forfeit the right to say, oh, you know, my spirit is strong, but the flesh is weak. That's what I want to get from this point on. You can no longer do that because we are the ones in control of the entire process. The less we know, well, the more complicated it is for us to put together a physical body. The more we know, the more beautiful we can make that physical body, healthier. When I say beauty here, I'm not talking about being a top model or an Adonis or this. It's not that. It's a beauty in the sense of how we act, okay? Some individuals may not have physical beauty that the way we judge beauty today, right? We have to remember that at one point in life, especially in Europe, okay, being being obese was considered beauty, also a position of status because it meant you could afford food. So we changed our concepts of beauty, right? Today, for instance, perhaps you have to go to the gym every single day, and that will be within the idea of beauty. Whatever it is, the idea of physical beauty it fluctuates. When I say beauty here is in the sense of how the person behaves. It's the whole package, right? This is what we mean by beauty. So, this is it. You have a circle, you have all this interaction. Now, we're going to change gears slightly. We are going to be talking about a little bit of science, all right? And yes, we do need this, okay? Just yesterday at Spiritist Society of Baltimore, when I was giving a lecture, I reminded everyone that we have this bad inclination, all of us, it's human nature, okay? We get to the Spiritist Center and we love to talk about obsession. I even said we are obsessed with obsession or disobsession, you know. We love to talk about that, but we also love to talk about abortion, we talk about euthanasia, we love to talk about addictions, But then we start talking, like I said at the very beginning, we try to put sentences together in Greek when we have never even studied the Greek alphabet. That's not possible. And then the moment that we say, no, we have to go back, stop this conversation, let's go back and see the background first. Say, no. The Greek alphabet is too complicated. The A is no longer the A we draw normally. It's something like this and that. I don't want you to learn that. Well, then you can't talk about Greek later. It's the same thing in Spiritism. We have to go and look at the background. This is the background to be able to talk about sexual behavior. This is the background for us now, I'm going to present to you, for us to be able to talk about addiction. So I'm going to introduce to you something you all have, but perhaps you're not aware you do, which is the neuronal cell, or neuron for short. That's one cell. But this cell, among the trillions of cells you have in your body, they are very, very, very special ones. First, okay, they have this very strange shape where they have this kind of like ramifications on this side. Then they have a little bulbous thing. Then they have a very, very slim, very thin indeed, very lanky, thin and tall, in this case thin and long, very lanky, okay, part here. And then another ramification at the other end. These are all very essential. They have to be like that. Neurons are the ones that connect two parts by transferring an electrical impulse. See a neuron as a wire that you have in a wall. In the same way that that wire is insulated so that the electricity will not go sideways, but then from one end to the other, neurons are also insulated. These light bluish structures you see here is the insulation. We're not going to go into that because that's not what is truly important. Just to give you an idea of what you can think of. Basically, neurons, most of the time, collect an information from this side through these ramifications. They're like antennas spreading out. Transfer it down this very lanky, very long pipe, and then release the information at this other end, right? So there is a directionality to the transfer of information. And the transfer of information is an electrical signal. If it receives an electrical signal here, it will transfer the electrical signal at this end. How is that electrical signal generated? If I take my hand and I move it closer and closer to the projector, I will feel heat. That heat becomes an electrical current here, becomes a stimulus, let's call it this way. A stimulus, in the plural, stimuli. Or, if I press hard on this table because it's a solid, I feel the pressure of the table pushing back on my finger. That pressure is the stimuli, the collection of all the pressure points become the stimuli that will activate this neuron. Okay, so heat, pressure, what's the other one? Right now, I'm using the other one by far, from all of you, light. All of you would not be able to see me if you could not collect the light that is bouncing off of me towards your retina, towards your eyes. That's another one. But I'm also using a second one that is also very important. Sound. You're collecting the sound, the pressure waves in the air, and these are stimuli to your neurons. So you're going to have neurons that will collect electrical impulses in the form of that came from sound, that came from pressure, that came from temperature, that came from light, and on and on. Okay? So we call these ramifications dendrites. We call this the body of the cell, okay? The cell body or soma, that's the nucleus of the cell. So this is tiny, tiny, tiny thing. You can't see it with the naked eye, okay? This very lanky, very long structure is called the axon. And at the other end, the axonal termini. And unfortunately, this is important for us here. So as I said, the dendrites pull the information in, the information travels down this pipe, and it comes out on the other side. On this side, I may have another neuron, so it's like passing the baton. One takes the information, passes it to the next one, which then passes to the next. Or on this side here, I may have a muscle. So I can dance. I can talk by moving my mouth. I can move my arms like this. Okay? So it will depend what we have on this side here. Okay? Or I can live if on this side here is the cardiac muscle that will be beating, because the neuron that is innervating that muscle is telling it contract, relax, which will be tum-tum, 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 which is a heartbeat. So depending what we have on this side, we will carry out a particular type of work. That's all. That's the essence of it. So when we talk about the neuron, okay, imagine, see here at the top, it's going to be repeating. You see, this is the signal coming all the way down and then spreading on this side again and again. So this is what the neuron's doing, picking up the signal on one side, releasing it at the other end for a particular purpose. And there is a directionality of it. So neurons are very specialized. So for instance, when I take my finger and I approach it from a hard surface, from the flame of a candle for the temperature and so on, right? The information is picked up here by the dendrites, all right? Then it travels the soma and it travels the axon all the way to my spinal cord, and from my spinal cord to my brain. Then in my brain, I have learned, oh, this is the flame of a candle, move away. So my brain perhaps will say, move the whole arm away from it. But now the brain has to generate a signal, right? So there will have to be another neuron in the reverse position, all right, to be carrying out the information that is generated here to my arm muscle to say, oops, do this, pull your arm away, protract, or protract in a different direction, retract your arm. So that's it. Now, why is the neuron so important? Okay, we're getting there. It's going to be quite interesting now. So imagine that we have a graph. Don't worry, I'm going to work through this graph very gently. And this graph, here we have the stimulus, the intensity. Is it a strong intensity or a weak one? How do we do this? For instance, is it a high temperature or a low temperature? Very hot, very cold, or even too hot. Or it can be, for instance, a lot of light, so you close your eyes, or just a little bit of light, so you squint because you can't get enough light inside, right? Or it can be, for instance, a very, very hard surface, or something that is soft, like a sponge. So the intensity of the signal is here. As it goes from bottom to top, it increases in intensity. Here is just the number of stimuli. I can have only one, I can have 2, 3, 4, and so on. So let us define here a certain intensity, which I will call the firing threshold. Bear with me for a second. If I have now a signal, a stimulus that is this small, isn't this below the firing threshold? It means that if this signal reaches the dendrites of my neuron, the head of the neuron at the beginning, that neuron will say, won't do anything with it, okay? Because it's below the firing threshold. So if I have another one like this one, isn't it still smaller? Okay? And if I have one that is just about grazing it, still doesn't do anything, all right? However, okay, so in any way, see, the stimulus is right there at the top. You see that little flashy, red light at the top? Okay? But nothing happens here, right? The neuron cell is alive, it's not dead. It's just saying, this is not enough to get me excited, which in this case is exactly, it's true figuratively as well as literally, okay? Because we say that neurons are excitable cells, they can be excited because you always apply a stimuli to them, okay? Now let us see what happens when my stimulus is larger than the threshold. It can be that size, it can even be bigger, and even bigger still. So now look what happens to a neuron like this. It gets the signal there and boom, it relays it to the other end because it is above the firing threshold. So that was what happened today. You woke up, you had a shower, The moment that you, well, there were so many things going on, but let's talk about when you just finished toweling yourself dry. You're now dry, and you put the first piece of garment on top of your body. The moment that it hits your skin, you tell if it's a coarse fabric, if it's a smooth fabric, it's even silky, you can say, right? Because the neurons, the receptors on your skin can sense that, pick up the information here at the top, and send it all the way to your brain. We usually say all the way up because the brain is at the top, right? But actually it's all the way down to the brain. Okay? Because it's downstream in the pathway. You don't think of where you are because maybe you could be lying in bed, for instance. All right? So you can just feel, for instance, how smooth your pillow feels or how soft and so on. So there it is. So when the stimuli are larger than the firing threshold, whatever comes is relayed to the other end. Good? Now let us see something quite interesting. There it is, the same thing, the firing threshold line. So anything above it will fire the neuron. Anything below it will not fire the neuron. And let us now make the stimuli all the same size, the same, see, they're all the same intensity, and they're all above the firing threshold. Good? All right, so you see that the neuron there is firing, it picks up the information, and boom, releases it here. Good? Well, that's exactly what I said to you. You had a shower, you were wet, you toweled yourself dry, and now you put the first piece of garment on top of your, basically the underwear, right, or the t-shirt. So it's right there, touching your skin. Good? Imagine if you had to go through your entire day feeling that fabric the whole time. Okay? Now, sometimes that happens. We call that what? Oh, this is itchy. It's uncomfortable. Perhaps your skin doesn't like that type of fabric. But normally, that's not what we want to do. All we want to know is, yes, I dressed myself this morning, hopefully, and then go about it without remembering feeling the fabric on the skin. So, something happens. It's called accommodation or desensitization. The neuron itself raises the threshold. So now the same stimuli that we have, the same stimuli we had before are below the threshold, and the neuron stops firing. Okay? This is what happens naturally. You put your clothes on. The first time they hit you, you hit your skin, you sense it, you're firing. Eventually, those neurons that were firing, they learn and they accommodate. And now, the same stimulus, because you didn't change clothing, right? You didn't change the fabric, so the stimulus is the same. Good? So by raising it, by accommodating, you stop firing. Let me ask you something. It immediately begs the question, if now I want to make this neuron fire again, what would I have to do? I have to make a stronger stimulus. Okay? Guess what? It will accommodate again. So you're always upping the dose to get the same final result, which is firing. You begin to see now the link with addiction. There we go. Right? So, just to rehash this important point, okay, you have the stimuli that are all the same, all right? And then the neuron will be firing if you had this. Now, just so you know, of course, because of real estate in the slide, all right, I am representing just a handful of shots, okay? In essence, they are in the millions or billions, okay? It's not like one or two and your neuron is accommodating. It's not as direct like that. But here, I'm giving you the concept. And so as not to crowd the slide too much, I only put one or two shots every time. Good? So, if you have stimuli above the threshold, the neuron fires, which you see over here, passing on the information, the baton to the next thing. Okay? If now I push the firing threshold up, the same signal can no longer make that neuron fire. It doesn't excite that neuron anymore. Okay? So then, here we are going to see the same thing, and now we are going to see the the phenomenon of upping the dose. We see the neuron firing with this type of signal, then we raise the threshold, and the very same type of signal will no longer have any application or any effect on that neuron. It stops firing. Okay? So if now I continue to give the same neuron, the same stimuli, okay, or the same intensity of stimulus, you see, like here in very light blue, I made that on purpose. I know it's difficult to see. Okay? In other words, if I keep the same clothing on top of my skin is okay with it. It will not fire anymore. If I change skin, I may be changing the stimuli. Okay? But let's say that this is no longer talking about skin. Let us say, for instance, that I drink alcohol and I get a little tipsy. No, I'm not even talking about being a drunkard, okay, or making a scene. I drink alcohol, and when I go a little above a certain level of amount of alcohol in my blood, okay, I get tipsy. And the tipsy is a particular combination, okay, of neurons firing. Not just one anymore, but a combination, right? So I get tipsy and I like that. And I drink, and eventually my neurons learn from my behavior and accommodate. So the same amount of alcoholic beverage will not give me that same tipsy feeling. What do? I drink more. Or I go for a stronger drink. I will start with a beer, perhaps I will go towards wine. From wine I will hop to vodka. Okay, and sake, the largest ethanol or alcohol-containing beverages we know that are still legal. Okay, so you up the dose. The only way to make this neuron that was firing before continue to fire once it has learned is to push the dose up, push the intensity of the initial stimuli, okay, up. So in this, it becomes a vicious circle. A vicious circle. Why is that? Because eventually even this one over here, right, will also accommodate. Remember, it's the same cell, just in different stages. So even the same cell here that was once learned and accommodated will accommodate again. And then I will push the dose again. And it will accommodate again, and I'll push the dose again. There is only one problem. You might think that you can do this to infinity, right? And of course, drug addicts think that they can push this to infinity and beyond. The problem is that this is a biological cell. This is a biological entity. It will break apart way before you can push it many, many times up. All right? And this is when we have all the problems that we can derive from any binging behavior. A binging behavior in psychology means any behavior that goes awry, that goes out of control. When you do it in excess. It can be excess eating, it can be excess working, it can be excess sleeping, it can be excess of anything that goes out of the normal pattern, okay, for the physiology of the human body becomes a binging thing. Now, a binging does not necessarily mean the individual is doing something out of negligence. There are diseases that lead us to binging. So we have to be very careful not to be judgmental here. What we are analyzing is the situation, the behavior, not what led to it and who to blame. That's not the point here. Okay? So now that we have this, all right, this scenario here, we can begin talking a little bit more. Okay. All right, so now if you no longer look just at one neuron, but billions of them firing at the same time, that's what you see. This is the brain of it's a human brain of a person who's alive, mind you. All right, so we put the person into an instrument called the functional MRI, right? And then you may read something to the person, or you may actually excite the individual with music. You give a particular type of stimuli, okay? And the person is going to respond to that by having parts of his or her brain, all right, shine, become bright. What you're seeing here is the thalamic part of the brain. And the thalamic part we'll see later on why it's important, but this is the part that controls a lot of our involuntary mechanisms. So just to give you an idea, so every time you see these things flashing, what you are actually seeing is the collection of all those neurons I spoke to you before in the billions. And we map them as colors now because, you know, we cannot, it would be a lot more difficult to represent it with electricity going through cells. So we're putting them all together in one. So then, it's our nervous system. If we're going to be talking about sex and sexual behavior, actually any behavior, we must talk about our nervous system. And the nervous system in human beings is primarily divided into a central and a peripheral one. The central is here, is the brain, the cerebellum, the spinal cord, and the peripheral are all the nerves that go towards our arms and our limbs, arms, legs, okay? Even the ones that go into the viscera, the organs inside our you know, the abdominal area and thoracic area, okay? So once we have that, we can divide the peripheral one, again, into two parts. There is the autonomic one, and there is the somatic one. Give me a second, you will see how important it is to make these distinctions. The autonomic one, not automatic, autonomic, is the one that controls things for us. We don't have control over that, or very, very, very little control. Autonomic one is the one that makes our heart beat. Our lungs inflate and deflate by moving the diaphragm in our cavity so we can breathe. The autonomic is the one that allows you to be there, and every now and again when I'm looking at you, you go like this. And you swallow. You swallow the excess saliva. You don't control that. I mean, I can add to it by doing it on purpose, like this. But normally, you do that without thinking about. Blinking, all of that is right here. The somatic one is what I'm doing right now. I'm standing up, I'm moving this way a little bit, I sway a little bit to that side, I move my arm, and so on. I choose the movement. So somatic is that when I choose, I have full control of this part. Okay? Now, when we speak of the I just want to get rid of the, yep. There it is, that's fine, that's fine. So in this one, the autonomic one, I can have it divided into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Oh my goodness, calm yourselves. They work as a pair. What one does, the other one tries to undo. That's basically it. Why is that? Because one is the police of the other. One is the surveillance mechanism of the other, so that we don't overdo it. Neurons are very fragile cells. If we overdo things to them, they die, and we cannot regenerate them. Neurons are one of the very few cells in our bodies we cannot regenerate. So this is actually a mechanism, right? So for instance, if I am speeding up the heart rate, which is what the sympathetic does, the parasympathetic tries to slow it down. So a better way of understanding this is the sympathetic is the fight or flight response. It's the one that tells, you know, my vision, all right, to look at far away because I'm looking for a route of escape. So I'm not going to be using my sympathetic to read a book at a close distance. Okay, my sympathetic is the one that speeds up my heart rate, makes me breathe faster and pull more air each time because it's readying me for a fight or for flying away from a scene. This one is what I like to call, I tell my students, the parasympathetic is the opposite. This is your Thanksgiving dinner type. Okay, when you've eaten more than your fill, and now you're just waiting for the world to end in the form of a couch so you can go sitting down. All right? So the parasympathetic is what we call the rest and digest. It will not have your muscles readied. It will not make anything in the sense of trying to make you move away, but rather stay put and digest the food that you might have ingested. So here, instead of implementing better, further vision, it actually implements the the vision that is nearby. Here, it slows down your heart rate. It also makes your heart pump less blood. Here, it makes you breathe more calmly, more restfully. And it pulls some of the blood away from the extremities towards the viscera, because the idea is that you might have eaten, so I have to absorb the nutrients. This is why you have that feeling of relaxation after a meal. That is done on purpose. That's your parasympathetic acting on you. When we speak of sexual behavior, okay, now let's join everything together. Now we begin to put everything together. Remember that I said the sympathetic is the one that pushes blood from your intestinal area, in stomach area, towards your muscles, because it's the flight or fight response, right? Here you want movement, here you don't want movement. So the sympathetic is the one that is going to be leading you to the orgasm, the culmination of the sexual act, because that is the part that takes the highest amount of energy, okay? The parasympathetic is the opposite. The parasympathetic moves you away from the orgasm, or if it's pre-sexual act, is the one that will lead you to arousal. The most important thing for us to understand is this. Either you have a nervous system or you don't. There is no way for you to have it all like this and not have the parasympathetic, or for you to have the parasympathetic and not have the sympathetic. They are built together. So if you have a defect here, you most likely are going to have something here, okay? Or you are not going to be viable. You won't be a viable human being. You won't be alive to actually be a witness to it, all right? So all of these things here, we have them. Whether we use certain parts of it or not, especially when we talk about the sexual act or not, is a different story. The other important point from this diagram is the following. It doesn't matter what you are, what gender you are, okay? You all have. This is human physiology. If you have a human physical body, if your spirit is associated to a human physical body, you have all of this. It's built in. Which brings us to the question that usually people want to ask. Did Jesus have this? Yes. Jesus, the man, the human being, so that we don't make the discrimination to gender, okay? The human being had a human being physical body. So it had all of this, with the sympathetic, with the parasympathetic. So if he had to go through anything in the sense of the sexual act, whether it's arousal, he would be using the parasympathetic, or the culmination, the orgasm, he would be using the sympathetic part of the autonomic peripheral nervous system. Okay? Whenever we say that, people's eyebrows hit the roof, right? They make almost, sometimes I have to scrape them off afterwards, right? But the truth is, the moment that you have a physical body, you cannot deny that nature of it. So then the natural question that follows this one is the following. Well, if we all have, how is it possible that you have individuals that are celibate and that, okay, and individuals that for instance, do not have, because you can be celibate but not necessarily avoid sexual intercourse, the sexual act, right? These things are separate, right? So how is it possible that we can have control over these things? You have just told me that we have a nervous system, the peripheral is divided into autonomic and somatic, and the autonomic is the one you don't have control. Physically, we don't have control over the autonomic system. But there is another layer that I have not shown to you here. Let us look at it. So this is it. The same nervous system can be split into these two parts, okay, that together compose that system. Don't forget that. You have everything, okay? So let us now see it in a different way, okay? We talk about the brain, the spinal cord here. We talk about the peripheral nerves here. I'm just going to put now organs that you can relate to, so you don't get boggled down by the nomenclature that we use. Then here is where you have your muscles for the muscles of, this area here, the visceral muscles, the cardiac muscles. And on this side is where you have your skeletal muscles, the one that allows you to move, right? To make any sort of movement. Moving your mouth, okay, blinking, all of these are, okay, skeletal muscles. They can be as big as the muscles of your thigh, which are very long and thick, or they can be as delicate as the muscles that move the eyelid, for instance, or tiny ones that we have around the eye area that makes us smile in a different way and so on, make us look cute sometimes or upset, frowning, okay, so on. So that is the idea. If we now keep this in mind, let us see the next layer. It's the mind. The mind is not in the spirit. The mind is just the word that we have in psychology and psychiatry to speak of it, all right? And today even psychology acknowledges the fact that the mind is not in the physical body. But for us spiritists, the mind is the spirit, all right? So it's not a piece of the spirit, because if the spirit is an essence, it cannot be subdivided. So we cannot say, oh, this is the mind of my spirit. No, because if this is the mind of my spirit, what is that is non-mind? What is that does not represent a mind? So the mind is the spirit. So here we have now the one that can control all of that. And let us see how it's done, all right? Through movement of fluids from the perispiritual side or plane to the physical side or plane. And it's moved, and these fluids come into our physical body, for lack of a better structure, through the points of centers of energy, which you might also know as chakras. I'm going to move away from that because it has a slight different connotation, but you can understand them as chakras. And we have 7 of them, all right, that are the most important ones. Now, have you ever asked yourselves, why is it that we have 7 points and not 6 or 10, why is it that they are located the way where they are located? All of these questions, right, are kind of strange in principle. Right? Or even you can ask, what is that person doing when I sit there to have passes, you know? I can buy a fan on my own. I don't need someone just fanning me. It's not even very efficient. So why is it that the person has to move the hands in a particular order? All of these things are important. Well, first question, why are the centers of energy where they are? Because they actually correspond, each one of them actually corresponds in the human physiology to a point in our body where many of these nerve fibers, many of these neurons pass in a very tight area, okay? They correspond to what we call in anatomy neural plexus or plexi for more than one. It's a bundle of nerves that's passing right at that position. So each one of these centers of energy are simply on the outside because, of course, I cannot cut anyone open alive, all right? But they correspond internally to a neural plexus, to a point where a lot of nerves, neuronal cells are going through. So they are not willy-nilly. Their location is not willy-nilly. They actually mean something, even anatomically. And if the nerve fibers are the ones moving information from point A to point B, from one end to another, okay, it makes sense that the fluids from the perispiritual side should tap into that system. So we have then the one at the top, coronal. Avoid saying crown, because crown doesn't really mean exactly it. It's coronal, okay? That's the first one. And that, you might think, oh, it's here, right? That's normally what we do. And even when we give passes, we put the hand right above the person's head. We don't touch, but we put above, hovering over that head. Well, that's a misconception. It is related to the cerebral cortex, the outer area of our brain, which is the area of cognition, is the area that pulls all the information from the body and makes well-educated decisions. So that's the cognition, the cognitive part of the brain. So this here, the coronal, is related to the whole, the cerebral cortex, the outside. The cortex is like the little outside of our brain. like the skin of it, okay? Where we process, we accumulate information from different sources and we process them together as a whole, okay? It's the highest level of thinking. This is why in us, all right, in us, the most complex form of life on this planet, one of the things that distinguishes us from all the other animals, even close ones to us, is the size of the cerebral cortex. It's not the size of the brain. It's the size of the cerebral cortex compared to the rest of the brain. And we even had to expand our skull to be able, in evolution, to accommodate that, right? So that's the first one. Then we have the frontal center of energy. That C there is for center of energy. The frontal one is the one that is using just the frontal side of our cerebral cortex, right? Then we go on and we have another one here, the laryngeal. Oops, and I skipped one, right? The reason I skipped is because for this conversation today, the laryngeal one, this one, is not important. It's not that it's not important at all. It's just not important for our discussion today. So the next one is the cardiac, which you saw is right here, okay? Then you have this splenic one, all right? You're going to have the umbilical one, and finally, the root. And this is the one that actually is related to the sexual activity, right? Now, chakras are all important. The energy flows through the coronal one and gets distributed to all the others. We have a tendency to think that it gets distributed as a domino effect, that it's passed like boom, 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 boom. Very good. So next time you want to move the tip of your finger like this, you tell your brain first to move it to the neck to the spinal cord to your thorax to your arm, the arm to the forearm to the hand to the first phalange of your finger, to the second one, and then the third one for you to move. By the time you do all that, you have your finger burnt from a flame of a candle, right? No, the information goes zoom, straight from here to where it has to go. That neuron that I told you about starts around the spinal cord and goes all the way to the tip of your finger. One long thing. So that cell, remember I said it was very lanky, very long and thin? That axonal side of that cell can be very long. So it is here. The flow goes through the corona, but the corona then distributes right away to whatever it has to do. So to be able to get to the root, it doesn't have to go through everything else. That is a misconception. Okay? It would not be in sync, in harmony with the human physiology. And we have to respect the human physiology because eventually these are driving a human car. Okay? No matter what we want to think about this car, whether it's a Cadillac, a Ferrari, or just a buggy, a Beetle, but it doesn't matter. It's still a human car. So it has to obey the human physiology. So this here is where the mind is going to basically pour over this entire complicated structure we have been looking at, right? And control that for us. So we have all of this, the division of the nervous system. We have then what it's associated with. And now we have our emotions pouring down from our mind and flooding each and every point of this diagram. It is here that we can exercise the control over our behavior. It is here by educating the mind morally and intellectually, all right? And intellectually. Because if you, especially when you talk about sex, if you don't educate yourself intellectually, by intellectually I mean that you don't just think of charity, all right? Normally that's the association we have. Intellectually doesn't mean, for instance, that you're going to be doing rocket science, that you're going to be talking difficult in such a way that nobody can understand. It's not that. It's just education. So if you don't educate yourself about sex in particular, trust me, you can have your moral side as developed as you want, you will still not be able to have a proper, healthy behavior towards it. It does require education as well. But this is the mechanism. So the mind is going to pour down all over this. And it's here that you have the control. And the control is extraordinarily important because when we talk about everything that we do in life, this is how we behave in very simple terms. Before an experience, you create expectations. All right? You create expectations. Then you go through the experience, and the experience produces an outcome. All right? Now, if the outcome matches your expectations, all right, you have what we call a positive feedback. Be very careful. I never said it was a positive result. I said it's a positive feedback. The point of a positive feedback is that you will want to do it again. That's all. So the results may be positive or negative, but the positive feedback still encourages me. It's an agreeable experience because it matches what I wanted, okay, and encourages repetition. But think about it this way. I drink or I smoke, especially, not necessarily cigarettes, but let's say now you talk about marijuana, you talk about anything, or you will inject yourself with something that will produce that sense of euphoria or that sense of a high. That's positive feedback. You want to go back to that. That's why you become addicted. But are you talking about a negative or a positive result overall? So we have to be very careful. Just because the outcome matched my expectations doesn't mean necessarily that the positive feedback is producing also a positive result. Let's think about something else. You surround yourself with sycophants, only people that say yes. Everything you say is always perfect. Everything that you say is always nice. You are the best person in the whole world. You are this and this and that, right? Positive feedback. We all want to hear that the whole time, of course. Who wants to have someone next to you that is constantly reminding you that you make this mistake, grammatical mistake, or that you make this mistake in life, or this and that, or even that someone that only occasionally will remind you, don't do this or don't do that, don't say it this way, right? So it's positive feedback, but in the long run, are these individuals around you contributing to your growth as a human being and your spiritual? Of course not. So it's a negative result. The other side of it is when you have a negative feedback. Negative feedback is the opposite. It will discourage you, will try to make you avoid, and will prompt you for a reevaluation of your entire experience. The result, again, may be positive or negative. If it's something, for instance, that, like I said, having someone that occasionally tells you, listen, don't say it like that, Julio, or don't say such a thing altogether, right? Don't say bad words, don't curse and things like that. Well, you may not like it's a negative feedback in the sense that I don't want to be told what to do, what to say, how to think, and so on. But in the long run, it's a positive result because I grow, I mature as an individual. With sex, with any form of addiction, okay, and in sex when it can become an addiction as well, if it is misconstrued, right? It's the same thing. We create an experience, we create an expectation of the process, and then we go through the experience, which is a sexual act, sex itself, and then there's an outcome from it. So depending on what we had as an expectation, it can be disastrous, right? So for instance, when we have associated to sex only the physicality, no emotion. So we look for the largest partner, or the most beautiful partner, or the individual that perhaps has the most stamina, or the individual, for instance, that perhaps knows tricks and moves and this. And when we take something so beautiful as the act that leads to the reproduction of our species, that the act that allows another spirit to join us here on this plane of existence, give them an opportunity for reincarnation. When we take something that is so beautiful like that and we trivialize it, right, which is what happens to adolescents at first. This is why they have to be educated about these things. Right? Because it's natural for them to see it like that, because that's when we are at our fittest, the stamina is the highest, okay? In terms of muscular activity, it's the same thing, okay? Everything, gravity has not even started to win over, right? So nothing is sagging, nothing is drooping or anything. So they are beautiful. That is the time. And this is why, that is when we develop our reproductive organs to the point that we can actually reproduce. No wonder. Evolution is not that stupid. Knew exactly, actually, it's not that it knew, but it evolved that way. But if we now take it this way, as now more as an adult, or it doesn't really matter the age. Young adult, old adult, middle-aged adult, or adolescent. The point is, when we go into that situation, we create a certain expectation. So all that beauty and this and that, we go through the experience, and then we realize that it has nothing to do with it. Even, okay, so I'll just stop a second here. So we go through it, and it's not fulfilling. The outcome doesn't match our expectation. What will happen? It's a negative feedback. So I may actually place myself into a position where I might get to one disturbing behavior, which is I will not have it again. I don't want to have anything like that again. Or I'm not fit for it, I don't have the stamina for it, or the partner will always see me as a person that cannot do this or cannot do that. So all of these things will lead me, this negative feedback, to a very negative connotation about the sexual act itself. The other possibility is that I go into it with this very frivolous attitude. All right? I experience the sexual act. The outcome matches because it is as void as my initial expectations. It's a positive feedback. But here's the interesting thing. It's a positive feedback with a negative result. Because now, what do? What is the final consequence of this situation? Because we are sentient individuals, intelligent individuals, emotional individuals. We have that emotion. It's that emotion that controls everything. The emotions are not fulfilled. So even though it's now positive feedback, okay, and the outcome even matched my expectation, I went in, I just wanted for the thrill of it because I'm young still and I this and that and I want to practice, whatever it is that it's misconstrued about the sexual act. The outcome is matching because it was exactly like that, no connection with the partner, no association, emotional association. Then the emotional part is void, empty. But isn't the emotional part the one that controls everything? So it will naturally, consequentially, push you to another one, and another one, and another one. Because you're never fulfilled. So you hop, skip, jump from partner to partner, from sexual partner to sexual partner, but never a companion. Attached to the sexual act itself, there is no emotional attachment. There is no sharing of values, which is the most important thing. Remember when I said that the root center of energy was the one that was related to the sexual act? The root center of energy is also the artistic center in us. So that part is not fulfilled. So we don't see the beauty in life. Life is just something to be used. The same way that I used others, human beings, in my sexual experience, in my sexual behavior. Okay? Because that center of energy is not firing back up to the root center of energy, saying to the coronal center of energy, saying, I am fulfilled. Take this information that I'm gathering, take all this positive, constructive energy, fluid, and move this into the spirit to renew it. Remember the snapshots? Take a much beautiful snapshot. Okay, this was an association with a partner, with a collaborator in that, with an individual that associates it, himself, herself, to my feelings. No, there's nothing like that. So there's an emptiness, and that emptiness gets moved all the way up. The perispirit takes a snapshot and says, "Okay, it's a blank photo." It opens up the camera in the old days, okay, and then puts a new roll of film in and tries again. Daniel will probably be having a hard time up there, like a canary, and say, no, just swap the card and get a larger card. It doesn't really matter. The point is, you take a snapshot that is a blank image. So you go on for the next partner, and one partner to another to another. It is always empty. So you see the two extremes. You see the extreme where the person looks at it and just doesn't want to have anything with it. That is not healthy. You may choose not to have a sexual life. Some individuals have done that throughout the course of history, okay? But you need to understand that the urges will be there. This is why I said before that you had all that map of the nervous system all the way to the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. That's why I also wanted to scandalize you a little bit by saying Jesus as the man, as the human being, had that. The urges were there, all the needs were there, but the emotion, the mind of that spirit, Christ now, was so much more than the body of Jesus, the man, the human being, that the mind made those urges into something that was artistic, that was beyond our comprehension even today, without having to go through the sexual act. But we're not there yet. For us, the sexual act is still a form of us of creating. We are, in that moment, a co-creator in a minor, very, very, very minor scale. Because by the sexual act, we allow someone, as I said, to come to this world. And even when the sexual act doesn't lead to reproduction, okay, is the intertwining, not of the spirits, but it's the intertwining of the emotions of those two beings, whatever they are. And this is what is important. But if there is no partnership, if there is no association, the consequence, whether it is going to be a positive feedback or a negative one, and we saw the two extremes, when a negative one led me to no sex whatsoever, completely, like it became like something I should fear. Or the other one where I go like a little stamping machine, one after another, just writing notches on my bedpost, but without any meaningful relations. So when we do this, we are taking snapshots that are blank for us. We are not actually doing ourselves anything positive, anything constructive. We need to understand and then change our expectations. The sexual act, whether we are, let's say, formally married or not, it really doesn't matter. But we need to understand that as we are going to age, we need a companion next to us. Because if we are only thinking like the initial adolescent thinking, which is fine at that age, but not later on in life, okay? If we think that we're going to be that beautiful, that strong for the rest of our lives and all of that, okay? What will happen in the end is that what we need later in life, when we cannot have the same amount of stamina, the same muscular strength and so on, is the companion. And if the person next to you, you can't even sit in a couch with that person for 5 minutes and have a conversation, you are in trouble. Because you created an expectation that is unbelievable. That individual, no matter how that individual loves you, here I'm going to use the word love very loosely, okay? Not because that's the individual's fault, just because of what your expectation of what love is. That individual loves you, no matter how much love and respect there is there, that individual will never be able to match your expectations. You have set the bar beyond what is possible. It doesn't matter what that person is doing. That person can be doing somersaults. It will never, ever measure up to those standards you have created for yourself. This is why we need to be very careful not to see it in a situation where we have a denial, a complete denial, we renege it completely, or the opposite, which is that system that I showed you before, all of that overdoing it because we desensitize ourselves to it. So the excess of sensuality that we see today in our society is desensitizing us to the real act of sex, to the real sexual act, to the partnership, to a partner in crime, the crime being the sharing of our emotions. Here we say a partner in crime in a nice way, of course, right? So all this excess pushes all our cognitive system to accommodate and always want more, to be excited, to be stimulated. And then eventually we reach a point that our partner cannot match those standards. So we have to be very careful. This is not being approved. It has nothing to do with that. It's not being approved. But if you're going to sell yogurt in a commercial on TV, an ad, you don't have to put a person that's half naked. what is the body, what does the body have to do with the yogurt? You might say, oh, because it's showing the person is healthy. You can show the person is healthy in many different ways. We are abusing all of these things. Remember that by the time you wake up and you go to bed, you have been bombarded here in the US in particular, but it's usually an average in developed countries, between 8,000 and 9,000 ads a day. Okay? Half of them are about sensual behavior or minor sexual connotations and innuendos and read between the lines type of thing. You are having that subliminal message and you're desensitizing yourselves. So yes, there is a place for it. We have to talk about it. We have to have it. But not every time, because you don't work every time, you don't sleep every time, you don't eat every time, because all of that is a binging behavior. All of that leads to that accommodation and that desensitization, and will always require from you a higher dose, upping the dose, and so on. Okay? So, there you have it. Just to remind you, once again, of the desensitization. And I hope that I'm sorry about the science. I know that it's usually not what people want to see in a spiritist, but you understand now how it was important for me to do this. Because otherwise, if I say, oh, you desensitize yourself, you go home as an intelligent person, you say, how? There was a void in the lecture. So we had to go through this. It's very important that we understand these things, even if we don't remember the names now, but at least you were exposed to it once. Some of it will be there with you, and you say, no, I had this once. I understand that there is something that is physiological in us, but no matter how much physiology there is, my mind, my spirit is there presiding over all that, controlling all of it. Okay, so now if this was the last thing, I just want to acknowledge your presence here. It's a Sunday morning, which is amazing. Thank you very much. Okay, and thank you, the Spiritist Society of North Beach, for the invitation.
Any question that you would like to address to Julio?
If you don't have, I will have one. So might as well speak. Speak up. I'm just moving towards you because they asked me so that they can capture it.
Okay, that's okay. I'm not intimidated. And you may have addressed this. There were points where I was kind of thinking what was being said before and digesting it. But how can someone, or is it even possible, reset that firing line, sort of? That might not be the right word.
Mm-hmm.
So that you are, again, sensitive at a lower level. Is it even possible?
So the question is if we can readjust that firing line back down to the, yes, it is. We call this neurons are very plastic. They have plasticity. In other words, they can adapt in the same way that they adapt up, they can adapt back down. Okay? Desensitize yourself. All right? Well, that's what happens. I'll give you the example that is easier for us to grasp. Okay, a drug addict that goes into a rehab clinic, right? What's the first thing that you do? You don't take away the drug all of a sudden. You change it to a drug that is less invasive, but you're still giving some sort of high, but you eventually bring the dose down slowly enough that the person can accommodate nicely, all right, until the person is no longer using anything at all. With sexual activity, if you think about it, it's just a little more complex because the sexual act also involves the emotions, the cognitive aspect of it, and so it's not like you stick a needle in your arm and you go like, oh, you know, with all the ecstasy and the euphoria. It's not like that. It's much more complex. But you can think about it this way. Well, what is it that you're doing today? Are you looking at a lot of lewd material? Are you looking at, do you go and you only choose movies that are only going to show some sensual scene and so? So start toning it down. Don't take it. Don't quit it cold turkey, as we call it, because you won't be able to maintain that. Just start toning it down. Allow yourself. This is a cognitive ability. You're not dealing with only one neuron. For that, I had to show only one, otherwise it gets very complex. But the moment that we say it's a thought pattern or something, what is going on in our brains is like billions of these neurons are being used. So you have to desensitize yourself slowly. But yes, you can do that. This is when I always try to avoid the cliches, but unfortunately in this case there is no way. Knowing yourself, right? So look at what you're doing. All of us are doing, so this is not for you in particular. We have to look at what we are doing and we tone down accordingly. And what I tone down for myself may not be the same as it is for you. Perhaps you can tone down a lot more than I can, but I cannot at my stage. So there is no recipe that is general.
So this is a question from the web. Someone is asking about physical exercise. So does the physical exercise have the same mechanism like the threshold that, you know?
The physical exercise, if the person that asks the question is a runner, he or she is actually familiar with the second wind, which you get, you start running, and after a while you get very fatigued. And it's really it's a very strange feeling. Sometimes, if you're used to running, say, 8 miles, by the time you get to the 6th mile, you think, oh no, today, you start in your mind finding excuses to cut your exercising regime that day a little shorter, right? And then for some reason you persevere. That's the part in us that shows the difference between the ones that persevere and the ones that don't. And then after a few seconds, you catch a second wind. That's another injection of adrenaline in this case, all right? It's actually a neurotransmitter, okay, a hormone as well, okay? And you're going to have, sorry, it's a hormone, but it's going to affect a lot of neurons that are going to be firing and giving you that so-called second wind. So it's the same thing for exercising as well. And if you weightlifting or you play tennis, whatever exercise, it's the same thing. It's just that with the runners, there is even a name for it, to catch the second wind. It's like a second gasp of air. You breathe more easily. And you can finish that 10 mile or 8 mile, whatever it is that you used to run. But in the same way with everything else, you can also overdo, and you have a binging in sports as well. It's the whole thing. You see, think about it this way. Imagine that we are all here in this room. This room is the neuron. Okay? For 1 second. So let's imagine that. See, there's a door over there. There's a door over here. Now, let us imagine that this door here is the dendrite, or dendrites, the collection of them. And that's the axonal termini, the other end. We are going to get a piece of paper from this door and deliver it to someone that is outside through that door. Okay? Now, we are all part of the neuron inside. So as that signal comes in here, it gets passed to you, to you, to you, to you. Each one of us is going to be passing that baton until we get someone that is closest to that door, in this case would be Abigail, and she would be handing it over to someone who's outside. So the entire structure of the neuron is being affected, okay, as in cellular terms. Mm-hmm. The whole neuron from diabetes is destroyed? No. So diabetes will not... Oh, I will repeat the question. The question is, if you have diabetes, would that affect the neurons or the size of the neuron or the axon? No. Diabetes will not affect that part. It can have other consequences later that will lead to destruction of neurons, but not the diabetes itself. Okay? Diabetes will be not something that will be affecting neurons directly. Okay? But for instance, when we get poisoned by mercury, when we get poisoned by arsenic, okay, all of these things have an effect. Or for instance, if we work in dry cleaning, all those chemicals that are used for dry cleaning, the carbon, the organic compounds, lots of them, different ones, they are all very neurotoxic. Okay, so it's an environment where you have to be very careful. Those will affect the neurons directly. Okay? And we have neurodegenerative diseases that will affect the neurons as well. Okay. There are many of them, and you can have. Yes, Lou Gehrig's. we have like a list of, you have Lou Gehrig's, you have, for instance, you have Alzheimer's that we believe to be in some way neurodegenerative as well, you know, that's a component. There is Parkinson's disease, okay? So most of these diseases will be affecting a particular type of neuron, all right? So.
Just a little question. You mentioned diabetes. So the peripheral neuropathy that diabetes causes, what type of nerves does it affect?
So it's
that transmitted by neurons? Or?
So peripheral neuropathies are diseases. It's the general term for any disease that affects neurons that begin in the spinal cord and go towards the limbs, or that comes from the ends of the limbs or halfway through the limbs to the spinal cord, because that's the peripheral system, peripheral nervous system. Anything that is spinal cord, cerebellum, brain is the central nervous system. So in peripheral neuropathies are basically a combination of diseases, the collective name for diseases that affect the neurons on the outside. Okay? So there are situations, for instance, where people have no thermal sensitivity in one limb, like a hand or a whole arm, okay? Or both of them, but it's just here. This part is still intact. It just gives us an idea, okay, on where it is located or where the problem is located.
I have a question. No?
Oh.
Teacher? Sit down, please.
What is in the past? How does the past works through the mind and this system?
Okay. The fluids from the spirituality. Here we have to be careful. So it's going to be a little bit of a long answer, but first we need to understand fluids. When I say fluids, the first thing that you're thinking is water, for instance, liquid, right? A liquid. No. You have to broaden that. For instance, you know the tar that we use to make roads outside? Is it a fluid? No. Is it a fluid at room temperature? Let's say if I were to break a piece of tar from the asphalt right there, bring it over here and show you to you in my hand here. Is it a fluid? It is a fluid. See, what we think of a fluid in science, in physics, is the ability that the components of that structure, which I will call molecules, have to roll one over another and move from point A to point B. Some of these molecules move very quickly from point A to point B. Gas. Some move with intermediate velocities, the liquids, and some will take perhaps 100 years to move from point A to point B. That's what we call solids. So what we call a solid or a liquid or a gas is nothing more than a snapshot as opposed to a movie. There is a beautiful experiment to prove this that is being done in one university in Australia. I am embarrassed to say that I don't remember if it was the University of Melbourne or Adelaide, but I think it's Melbourne. Basically, they have a funnel made of glass, okay? It was started in the 1920s. It's a funnel, and there's tar inside. Tar, okay? And they have a camera here. So the funnel becomes very thin, right? And there's a little spout, which is open the whole time. And the camera detects when there is a drop from it. So a drop happens every 12 years, 10 years, a tiny little thing. I'm not talking about a piece breaking off from the main. I'm talking about a drop, okay? So it's been going on since the 1920s. It's flowing. So our concept of fluids is very static. It's like that snapshot. So water would be a fluid, right? A soup would be a composite fluid. Now, so fluids is much more. Now, having said that, the fluids that come from the spirituality to us, okay, are much more ethereal. Now, here's the interesting thing. Remember when I showed you the thalamic the image of the brain moving around. So this is the thalamic system. The thalamic system is the inner portion of our brain. So imagine that it's almost like a C structure like that over here in our brain, okay? But it occupies the center portion of it, buried inside, and it's one of the initial parts of our brain. Now, that thalamic system has neurons that go from that point inside of the brain to the cortex, which is on the outside. This pathway is where the fluids from the spirituality tap into. Right then and there. When they are gathered by the human physiology, but before they are processed by the human cognition. It's right between that pathway. So that is where we get the fluids from the spirituality. And that's where the fluids also go to the spirituality, if it's going the other direction, because it's actually a two-way system. That's your pathway. But we have no clue as to the how. We have very, very few inklings. For instance, why it happens in a neuron and not in other cells. We have found certain things that neurons have certain substances that neurons have that other cells do not have or not have in abundance. Okay? But it's still very, very early stages to say anything about it. All we know is this for sure. That's the path. So between the thalamus or the thalamic system and the cortex. Okay? So when it is being collected, the thalamus is the one that collects all the autonomic information from the physiology, the human physiology. But before it gets processed by the, let's say, conscious mind or the cognitive part of it, which is actually we should say, before it gets processed by the cortical area of the brain, the cognitive area of the brain, that's where it gets tapped into.
So, the
fluids pour down.
Coming also in the other.
No.
So only through that area.
You see, the moment that I'm giving you passes, and I put my hands over your head, and now the combination of my fluids, my magnetic energy, and the fluids from the spirituality goes straight into that connection, thalamus, cortical area, that part now is going to move all the information down. That's why we had to think about those neurons, how they fire, how they pass the baton to the next person or the one on this side, okay? So it goes there, and from there it gets distributed. And it makes sense that it happens right at that moment, because that is the part that will go everywhere in our body. If I were to go and tap at the cerebellum or some other part of the brain, that would be very specialized.
Okay, in the beginning you gave like a chart, for example, talking about in genetics, like you have here the parents, and then the children, and the aunts and the nephews. So how this could be, like in genetics, we transmit genes. How do you can bring, like, instead your grandfather maybe your child, like those things. So how this can be, there is a reason, like for example, let's put, sex addiction. That is, this came from a very past that is still influencing the person, that is reincarnated, or am I making myself better?
Let me see if I try to clear up a little bit. Basically, you're asking what is the difference between the genetic part, which we inherit from the physiology or the physical side, and the spiritual component.
Yes.
Okay? Well, never forget that when all the sperm are going towards the egg, right? You have millions of them in one egg. Okay? So there are different energies that each one of those sperm cells have, and the combination is going to be the combination that you have put together for that new physical body that you have. So in the tiny, small, very subtle variations that you have from each sperm cell that is going towards that, the one that is going to finally make it is the one that is going to create the body that's most adequate to you. It's still fulfilling the genetic prerogatives because the sperm came from a father, the egg is coming from the mother, right? A mother. But the one that is going to be chosen for it is the one that has the most vital fluid in the right amount for that, for the body that you will need for that future reincarnation process. In that sense is where the spiritual influence, let's put it this way, or let's call it the spiritual heritage, okay, can impose itself without derogating the laws of genetics. Because the father will produce many sperm cells. They're all from that father, right? They're all fulfilling the genetic laws that we know of, that we have studied, and even some that we don't even know yet, all right? But the important thing is that one of them is going to have, let's say, a special spiritual treatment. Let's say one of those sperm cells actually get a magnetic passes. It's actually going to be magnetized, because it has to be something that's physical. So it's going to be magnetized, and it will have a certain priority for that. It will be the most apt, let's put it this way, to complete the union and produce a viable initial cell. Yes. Yeah, exactly. Sigismundo, when Raquel is getting pregnant. Exactly. Very good point.
It's explained in details. If you want to know, just open the book and read the chapter on the reincarnation of Sigismundo. And you can read all the details.
That's what I was reading about. Missionaries of Life.
I just want to show a quick thing here, but you can ask me questions in the meantime, not a problem. I'm just trying to find something here. Because I know it's your question. I know it can be somewhat difficult to visualize these things. I have them in my head, but just quickly, I'm almost there.
We have time just to hope your train is not 2 o'clock. I hope it's 8 o'clock.
7. And you should be careful not to say these things to me, because my students know that I'm famous for staying in. This is your, next one. And there we go. Okay, let me turn this on. See thalamus here? So this is the thalamus, this part of the brain here. Okay, just around that C structure shape I told you about. And this is the cortical area. So this brain that you see here, it's as if you had sliced the person here. Okay, right in the middle. So you're seeing, in that case, you're seeing the right side of that brain. But there's also the left side that would put together to close it, right? So this is your thalamus. And we go back. So it's right there in the center. So this is what I was saying before. There are neurons that arrive at the thalamus, okay? And these neurons from the thalamus then go to the cortex. It is in this process here, between the thalamus and the cortex, that the fluids from the spirituality pour down and tap into it, all right? Just an interesting thing, these nerve fibers, or just fibers as we say usually, okay, are the fibers that bring the sensorial information. Vision, olfactory, auditory, degustatory, tactile information, which makes sense, right? The spirit wants to coordinate the Ferrari it's built. And to be able to coordinate the Ferrari it has built, it has to feel the pedals, it has to feel the wheel, okay? It has even to feel the asphalt. Is the car hugging the asphalt on a curve or not? Or it's just about to lift off and cause a disaster? All of that is coming towards the spirit by means of the sensorial apparatus. So remember, you don't see with your eyes, you don't hear with your ears, you don't taste with your tongue, or you do all of that with your brain. You capture light with your eyes, you capture sound waves with your ears, and so on. They are the receptors, the detectors, but the processing is here. So for instance, we actually see with the occipital part of our brain. So the signal from our eyes come all the way here, and then they go all the way down here to the occipital cortical area. It's at the back here, almost at the back of the, next to the nape, okay, at the back here. that that you're going to actually see. Okay, so when the fibers are leaving here and going towards the cortical area, right? Remember, this is in 3D, so it's going this way, that way, right? It's radiating from that point. This is right there in the center. Okay, that's when the fluids tap into it. And this is in Evolution in Two Worlds, chapter 13.
I think we are, I mean, I know we try to behave here with time, but
Sure, yeah,
the
answer.
speaker in the spirit, of course, you know, we are extending a little bit our meeting, our, you know, get together. But I have a question, and I might be the last one, and then during our lunch, of course, you can ask as many questions. I was planning to ask you the question nicely, beautifully, but, you know, I'm artistic. You know, artistic don't talk science. I come closer to Captain.
Okay.
When the information, it is created through the cell. Example, if you know it is a fire there, and you know if you put your hand there, you're gonna be burned, but that has already to be registered here. Or one day was empty. Makes sense, like for me, artistic, let me try to explain. Look at me here, artistic, try to explain to it on science. Here is the cell. We are created. The cell was created for the first time. That is the cell. The cell that is empty, or the cell has the information for me to know if I put in my finger there, I'm going to be burned.
Okay, so
Make sense?
makes sense.
So basically, how does the cell learn?
Yes.
I'm going to have to burn myself first to find out I cannot put in my finger. I mean,
Knowledge.
I know what we bring from another life. I know that I understand, but I use the cell to tell me, don't.
Right? No, I understand the question. I'm just going to get you a diagram. I think it'll be a little easier with the diagram because it's not something that it's not just direct like that. If I can remember where it is, if I actually remember to bring it.
Can I say something? Because one time I told my son, that's what made me to ask you the question. My son would like to imitate me, of course. I was rolling my hair with those arm curl, yes. And I told him, honey, don't touch, it's hot. I tried to explain to him it's hot. But the cell in his brain didn't know that yet.
Okay.
And then I let him touch. He learned, he burned himself a little bit, you know. I mean, didn't let him burn. But that's what made me to ask you the question. I burned my son one day very little for him to understand, don't touch.
Well, there are certain things we have to do it on our own. There are others that we learn from the mistakes of others. So, for instance, if just yesterday I was giving this example that if I stick my finger into an outlet and I get shocked and electrocuted and you all see it, you don't have to do it again to experience that. So we can actually learn collectively without having to actually do the deed, you know? That's one of the things that also separates from other things, from other animals in particular. Well, so let me show you something. Imagine that this is our evolutionary arrow, okay? And here's our creation, whenever that was. So this arrow is, as far as we can tell, on this planet at least over 2.5 billion years. And here, when it goes to, is the angelical state, whatever that is too, we don't know. All we can say is we can investigate this part, and we can know about this one because we are right there, okay? As we evolved, we didn't start as a spirit. We started as a monad. Think of a monad just as a different name, okay? In the same way that you call cell, fetus, baby, toddler, child, adolescent, young adult, and old person. It's still the same human being. It hasn't changed, but you give them different names. So the spirit, before being a spirit, before being promoted as such, it was a monad, all right? In the monad stage, we associated ourselves with different structures. In the same way that right now as spirit, we are associated to the physical body of a human being. Sorry to break to you, but you're not a human being. You are simply, you, the spirit, you're simply associated with a human being physical body. That is all. So before we are associated, we are never a rock, we are never a bacterium, we are never a cat or anything like that, but we are associated to other forms, right? And we started as associating ourselves to particles, atoms, molecules, compounds and structures. Then the first cells, the first organisms that had only one cell, all right? Then organisms that had many cells, pluricellular, and on and on. Then the first complex eukaryotic organisms, right? Then plants, animals, and eventually we get to a point when we become humans, okay? Well, we don't become human. Evolutionary speaking, we are going towards this part here. We're getting more and more complex physically. And the spirits that have dictated the echelon of spirits, the very high order spirits that actually dictated the book Evolution in Two Worlds, the book has been relayed to Francisco Xavier and Valdo Vieira by the spirit André Luiz, but he did not write that one. It came from much, much, much higher above. Okay? They say that we are going to be called spirits when we ingress in the human stage, when we started using the human car to drive. Until we drive human cars, when we're driving everything else, we don't call ourselves spirit. It's just a line, okay? But we need to understand that we are evolving slowly with that. As we are in this side, okay, we are going to be developing those things that you were talking about. So for me to develop a system where, imagine that this is a flame, okay? So when I do this and I'm moving my hand over there, the moment that I sense a temperature, I pull my hand back, okay? I actually pull my hand back before my brain can process the information that is going to burn. It's called an arc reflex. The information of the high temperature gets sent to my spinal cord, and in my spinal cord, as if it were a mini brain or a small microprocessor, it tells me, pull your arm away from it. And then it sends the information up for the brain to say, I just told it to move the arm away because it was going to get burned, in loose language. Okay? So this arc reflex was developed here.
So the information was not there. We didn't born with it.
No, it's in experiencing the world that we produce that information. And that information then got locked into the genetic code. As we go further and further here, we have more and more information built into our genetic code. All right? We don't build the information such as move your hand away from the flame. What we build is a system to detect high temperature and a system to push the muscles in the opposite direction. That's what it is. And that is what is encoded in our genetic makeup. This is very important. But we did not develop here. We developed all the way here. However, when we get into this Ferrari of a complex organism, because we are not the most evolved, we are the most complex form of life on the planet, okay? Our spirit has to deal with all of this. Now I'm not going only at the chugging speed of 5 miles an hour. I can go, 200 miles an hour. So I need to be a very good driver, right? So race driver. So what I do is during those few years of infancy, baby, toddler, child, okay, I get reacquainted with it very quickly. So it's not that I have to build the genetic code. The kid put the hand in the curling iron and immediately at a subconscious level retrieve the information for 2.5 billion years and never again. Okay? This is why from every reincarnation we learn faster and faster. It's just the way it is. Because we already bring the inkling, all of it built into us. All we have to do is be quickly reminded of it. And then We go from that point on. And this is also why the atavism that we can be creating for a future life, anything we prevent ourselves from experiencing today, or that we experience in a very destructive manner, will bring the consequences later for us. Not because God wants to punish us, not because our conscience wants to punish us, simply because we will have that unresolved issue in our heads, which in this case is the mind, the spirit, and the spirit will remember that, and in a future life impose it onto the physicality and say, go and fetch the information for me so I can solve this problem. But we have been building all of that. We built the first sensors right here with the first cellular organisms. I was this tiny, shy bacterium, right? Okay, it's called Lepidopteryx. It's in Evolution 2 Worlds. It's a very special name. But don't worry about it. Let's call it Schlupsi. It doesn't really matter. The point is, I was this bacteria I was sedentary. I couldn't move. So if the waters of the ocean were gentle enough to come all the way onto the shore and just splash me just gently, because if it splashes with a lot of violence, I get uprooted and I die. Just gently, and nutrients happen to pass by, I would feed myself. If not, I would starve myself, right? Eventually, what do? I find a way of, well, that would be for us, smelling the food. In this way, we'd say chemosense where the food is, all right? Chemosense. Have you ever dropped ink in a bowl of water and see how the ink slowly moves until, if you agitate, everything gets, let's say, blue or green or whatever ink color you're using, right? But if you drop it and you watch very gently, it moves very slowly until the whole bowl is the color of the ink, right? So it's the same thing. The food is there. The water is dissolving all the components of that food, so I could sense it. But then I had that, but how could I get to the food? I could just tell, oh, it's there, but now I'm going to die knowing that the food is there, but I can't get to it. So then eventually you begin to develop ways of kind of wiggling yourself all the way in that direction. From there, eventually you're going to create a better system of moving yourself, which is what we see today in something called flagellates. They have a flagellum. It's basically a very long hair that they beat very fast and look like an engine from a motorboat. And with that, they can move in the opposite direction of the beating, okay, of that flagellum. But it's only one cell. So for me to create legs, what is the first thing I have to have? Millions and billions of cells. So you see, I have to be building this very slowly. So we started building here. We built the first detectors. The detectors allowed us then to build better detectors and then ways of moving slowly towards that. But still, it's a way of moving before not moving at all. And from that, we started building better and better means of locomotion, as well as better and better sensory detectors. We don't have eyes right here. And even in certain organisms here that look like they have eyes, not even close to what we have today. The complexity, okay? So, but it was built into it. And in the physical evolution of the organism, it added that to its DNA, to its genetic makeup, which we are now using.
Thank you, Dan.
Oh, you're welcome.